Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 21 of Everyday Buddhism, making every day better. I'm excited to share the second in a series of episodes where I will talk with the Buddhist teachers that not only educated me in the Dharma, but shaped my life for the better. One of my first teachers said everyone is your teacher because everyone is a Buddha. That is true, but there are some teachers who come into your life and have major influences on you. In the last episode, I had a conversation with my sensei, Reverend Koyo Kabose, and today I'm talking with Frank Howard, who along with his wife Gretchen were my first in-person mentors in Buddhism and enabled my initial refuge and teaching with Lama Drupal Sonam Jorpal Rinpoche and teachings by many other wonderful teachers, including His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche and Khenpo Sherab Odzer. If not for Frank, Gretchen, and the center, and the guidance they offered me, I wouldn't have had the experience of being in the presence of these wonderful Tibetan teachers who radiated the wisdom and compassion of Buddha nature like the sun. I will offer a brief introduction, but I will also put Frank's full biography on my website. Frank is a local attorney and a director and teacher of the White Lotus Buddhist Center, Rochester's Tibetan Buddhist Temple. He has studied and practiced Buddhism since his early 20s, but actually began formal training at the Rochester Zen Center in 1971 under the direction of Roshi Philip Kapleau. In January of 1981, he and his wife made a pilgrimage to the Buddhist holy sites in India and Nepal. And then in 1985, after nearly 15 years of attending Zen meditation retreats, Frank met a Tibetan Lama, Khenchen Kanchog Gyaltsen, and had studied and practiced within the Tibetan tradition since that time. It seemed to me he sort of fell in love at that time with Tibetan teachers and Tibetan teachings. And he sure does radiate that faith in Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism in general. His knowledge and understanding about Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism in general have appeared as publications in the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic Monthly, Rochester City News, the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, and the magazines Shambhala Sun and Snow Lion Publications. He actually gave a series of public talks at SUNY Buffalo and was interviewed for The Mystical Arts of Tibet, a video produced by SUNY Buffalo concurrent with the visit of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2006. Frank continues to speak at various venues on topics concerning Tibetan Buddhism. Frank's taken empowerments and teachings from many excellent teachers, including the Dalai Lama, Chetsang Rinpoche, and many others. Frank and Gretchen have two daughters, Megan and Tracy, who many of us watched grow up while at the center. And Megan and Tracy are now graduates of Harvard and Columbia colleges, respectively. Tracy is in a PhD program at Columbia University in Tibetan literature, and Megan is in a PhD program at the University of California, Berkeley, in Tibetan Buddhist history. Both are fluent in classical and colloquial Tibetan and conversant in Mandarin. Additionally, Megan knows Sanskrit and studied Japanese. You'll find more about them in Frank's bio on my website as well. So I'm thrilled to have Frank on the podcast. I know you'll find his deep knowledge, faith, wonderful sense of humor, and contagious giggle a joy to listen to. So now to the recording. Well, hello, Frank Howard, and thank you for joining Everyday Buddhism. We're thrilled to have you here. I think it's going to be exciting because other than a recent episode I had with Pakchap Rinpoche and Eric Solomon when they were promoting their book Radically Happy: A User's Guide to the Mind, I have not touched Tibetan Buddhism much at all, although it does seep out through what I talk about in how I teach, because it's where I was where I had my comeuppance, I guess, if you will.
Well, thank you.
But I really wanted to have an expert in Tibetan Buddhism on, so that's you.
No, you flatter me, but I'm happy to be here. We've had a long friendship.
Yes, we have. Haven't seen you enough lately, but I guess when you have a good friendship, it doesn't much matter if years go by, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So you have a long, interesting history with Buddhism, and I explained it in my intro about your background, a little bit about, your background with different forms of Buddhism, your background in your family and so forth. But, I wanted to start by talking about your Zen to Tibetan transformance back in the early days, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's I think a lot of people would be interested in that because I think many of my podcast listeners are attracted to the podcast from a secular Buddhist point of view, the sort of the buzz term secular Buddhism because of Stephen Batchelor. But I also have, people who come from Tibetan Buddhism because I've attracted some listeners from that book I promoted with for Shambhala, and so I have a wide range. I don't think there's too many Zen, but there are some of that. So what I was interested in is what was the magic? What magic happened when you sort of went from practicing for 10, 15 years in the Zen tradition to then all of a sudden falling in love, right?
Yeah.
So tell me.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Of course, these things are, karmic, and one person's experience isn't really necessarily a model for anybody else's. But my original attraction to Buddhism was sort of coming out of a late teenage existential crisis. I was just so struck by the fact that we were all going to die, and that seemed terrifying to me. But it was such a place of no exit because, if you're really, really terrified of death, you can't even get out by, committing suicide.
Right.
And I looked around. I just felt like there was no exit, that I was trapped. And I looked around and everybody seemed not to be caring about this. And it all seemed rather dreamlike to me. And so those were the things that I was wrestling with, and I entered into 2 or 3 years of very eclectic kind of reading all over the place, talking to priests and different things, trying to find some answers to my questions. And when I came across, the Buddha's first noble truth, I felt like it was being, like he was speaking to me directly. So I thought, oh my goodness, maybe there are some answers here. So I had this interest. And then it was back in, this is like the late 60s that I was wrestling with this. And it wasn't until maybe 1970, 1971, somewhere in there, that, there wasn't much going on in the country in terms of, what we might call Western Buddhism. I'm sure there were some ethnic communities that had Dharma centers and temples and that, but I didn't have any contact with that. And I stumbled across the 3 pillars of Zen, in my reading.
Right.
And for the first time felt confident that there was actually something you could do. My view had been that, we were just were dealt a deck of cards, and that was too bad. It was kind of fatalistic. There's nothing you could really do about it. But it was reading the 3 pillars of Zen that gave me confidence that, you actually can train the mind, although I never thought about it in those terms. So at that time, I think there was the Rochester Zen Center. There was the San Francisco Zen Center. I think Eido Roshi was opening up the New York Zendo, I think it was called, in Manhattan, and it would in just a little bit. And the LA Zen Center hadn't opened yet. But I was attracted to the Rochester Zen Center. And my wife and I eventually became members there, moved to Rochester in about 1975, and became part of the community, participating in the sesshin. And then eventually we're on staff there for maybe 3 years. At the end of that time, we wanted to have a family, and the $50 a month room and board wasn't going to cut it. So we moved back to Minneapolis, where we had been raised, and our first child was born. But then eventually we moved back to Rochester because this is where most of our friends were, and we thought of just having the temple down the block sort of thing and leading kind of an ordinary middle-class life. And so we were there, members of the Zen Center, until 1985. And in 1985, a Kempo, Kenshin Konsal Gyaltsen, came to Rochester. And we heard that he was coming, and we just went to a very modest, he was at some sort of a Tai Chi center on South Clinton Avenue. And we went, and turns out we did a Chenrezig empowerment of Avalokiteshvara with him. And then the following year, again, unexpected and uninvited, a Drikun Lama, Ayang Rinpoche, came to Rochester. And lo and behold, there was a fellow who had been kind of one of the officials at the Rochester Zen Center, Fred Epsteiner, I think is his name. Terrible, I've forgotten his name. And he had been at the Zen Center and then decided to do a pilgrimage while still a member of the Zen Center. He was going to go to India and then Japan, saving the best for last, he thought. But in India, he happened to meet a Tibetan Lama, a Nyingma Lama, a layman named Zonar Rinpoche. And Freddie ended up doing a retreat with him. Then I don't think he went to Japan, came back to Rochester, and he had a little meditation group going on in his house. He was then moving to Florida and asked my wife and I if we would just sort of continue the little meditation group that he had going. And I said, sure. And so we were there. And then it was 2 weeks later that Ayang Rinpoche came to town.
Wow. And
he was preceded by a Western nun. And I invited her to this little meditation group, and she gave a little talk. And lo and behold, there was all this kind of spontaneous interest ballooning. And then when Ayang Rinpoche came to town, we had 100 people or something who came for initial teaching. Then he went to Toronto. Then he came back 2 weeks later and gave a Poa Lung, the oral transmission of one of these tantric teachings. And there was so much spontaneous interest that a little group was formed, and it was called the Drikun Kagyu Enlightenment Institute. And for me, it was rather remarkable. It was very emotional, not so much him personally, but I had this sense that the Mahayana teachings were coming to the West. That was the sense that I had of it. Mm-hmm. And it was very odd because I never felt any connection to Tibetan Buddhism at all. Looking back on it, it was kind of funny because living on the staff at the Zen Center, you had a little room that you lived in. My wife and I lived in this little room. And the Zen Center's practice at that time, I don't know what it's like now, but very much discouraged reading. I was working on koans and you weren't supposed to be reading. And I was sneaking books
right.
into my bedroom. So I was reading Lama Govinda, The Way of the White Cloud. I was reading The Life of Milarepa. And it never occurred to me that I had any interest in Tibetan Buddhism at all. But nonetheless, when this Tibetan Lama came to town, it was very emotional for me. Before he was coming, I kept having dreams and all sorts of, funny things. So anyway, that's how it happened. It was completely unexpected. We were still members of the Rochester Zen Center at that time. And for us, we felt like, my wife and I think, it's like your path kind of appeared for you. Yeah. And there was something nice about it because it wasn't, manipulated in the sense of me my ego trying to to direct my own spiritual development. It hit me despite myself.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that despite yourself, I think in my life is a very prevalent concept. Right. The things that have happened to me in directing my spiritual path one way or the other has almost, if I look back to each and every one of them, it's always been in spite of myself, It's all, I typically, and I look at this, I typically have my mind set on one thing, and then this other thing pops up and sort of kidnaps me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And consequently, I've had without any kind of reason for it. I can't take any credit, but I've had this natural kind of faith. And I think that's very helpful because Tibetan Buddhism, with its vast array of methods and meditations and practices, you can fall into kind of a mechanistic kind of view that I just, crank on one side of this this practice box, and look, I'm going to come out the other side as a Buddha, and my ego, aren't I wonderful? And then people can bow down to me, and all those kinds of delusions. And yet that faith brings first of all, a kind of renunciation. You're just dropping all your machinations, although they're still there, of course.
Right.
But at least the back of them has been broken, and you can see that this is kind of a falsity. All our scheming, all our all our trying to appear one way and acting another. All of that malarkey suddenly becomes visible to you. But at the same time, there's some sort of, there's something certainly non-conceptual, but there's also something unbidden. There's something that's deeper than our stated reasons to ourselves.
Yeah. Now, when you first started telling the story, and yet, indeed, I'm going to go back to that first part, but the other things that you added on sort of accentuate what I'm going to say here. Is when you first started telling the story, you hinted at that it was a karmic condition, right?
Yes.
And then, you sort of talk about like stumbling into these things happening, in spite of yourself, and then having a kind of faith, not a developed faith that you tried to develop. It just was. It was natural, right?
Yes.
Which almost sounds karmic too. Now, since I think a good 50% of my audience probably doesn't believe in that kind of thing.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? That's exactly, it's my interest here is bringing this stuff up. I think it's rare in today's world where you can talk about this stuff without having taking some sort of sides or something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then starting to be defensive and my way is better than your way and all this stuff. And I thought it would. How would you address an audience that you think is people who you think are primarily secular? And I think you probably get them in your center as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the key thing when I say faith, that's an English word, and it has all sorts of English antecedents and meaning to it. We usually think of it in a theistic way.
Right.
Where in the end, you have to believe in something that really can't be proven, can't be really believed in either. But the great figure is the one that believes in sort of impossibilities or something. But I'm told, I don't know Sanskrit, my daughter does, and I'm told that the word for faith in Buddhism is shraddha, and don't quote me on the pronunciation, but I'm told that it's more akin to confidence.
Oh yes.
In other words, Dalai Lama has said, for instance, that it's not blind faith. It's the Buddha himself is that Sutra to the Kalamas is,
right,
quoted again and again. Do not believe it because I say it. Don't believe it because a holy man told you that, or because it's in a sacred book, or because your elders. Only when you test it, with your own reason and experience, and then if it tends to benefit yourself and others, then adopt it. So nothing happens without confidence. We don't go into the room and switch on the light switch, except for the fact that we have confidence that it's going to work. And that confidence is reason. We've done it before. An electrician told us it's going to work now. I mean, I sometimes think of like the faith that we naturally have, say, in like Albert Einstein. I can't tell you really anything. Don't give me a quiz on relativity. But I really do have confidence that he did something that was valid and something that was useful.
Right.
And based on that, there's a whole lot of things that we have to have faith in something. Even the atheists have faith in that there's nothing to have faith in, I guess. But they have faith in that. We can't get away from needing to have faith. You can't have a relationship without taking a risk, sticking your neck out. We have faith all the time. So I feel very fortunate. I think it was a karmic result. And again, who knows how these things happen, but that's been a very sustaining thing for me with all the ups and downs and scandals and whatever's out there. There's still this basic faith in what the Buddha said, that we all have Buddha nature and that it can be developed just like he did. I have faith that he wasn't drunk, he wasn't mistaken, he wasn't crazy, he wasn't aggrandizing, all of those things. But for people who don't have faith, anybody who finds themselves with even a curiosity or even an opposition to Buddhism actually has
a craving,
enough faith for something to happen. They have enough contact with it because, the opposite of belief is not disbelief, it's basically apathy.
Right.
The ordinary being is just not thinking about these things at all until there's some huge crisis in their life, and then it's like too late. So, for instance, this man who was known for the political dark arts, Lee Atwater, he was the campaign manager for George W. Bush when he was first running for president, and he had done all these negative things as a campaigner, and then suddenly he got a brain tumor. He was like 46 years old, something like that. And it was so sad to me. He assigned his staff to go out and investigate all these different religions. Because suddenly, I hope it worked for him, but he was suddenly fearful of death and realizing the impermanence of life. But, you can't assign other people to do that for you. And so most people are like that. We're not thinking about it,
Right.
And yet, so for people who are secular, I just put your foot in the water, start doing some of these practices, see the effect on your mind. Like the Dalai Lama says, for instance, when you're angry, look in the mirror. Look, no one likes you. You look like a demon. Your face is bright red. Everyone avoids you at the office, even though you don't say anything.
Right.
And he said, rather, the teaching is patience is like the antidote to anger. And you can practice patience and see how you feel, if you feel better or whatever. And it's a gradual path. A faith is the ability to keep at it consistently. Because what happens is, even though I think patience is the antidote to anger. But when the anger comes up, it's so powerful, you don't even think about patience.
Yeah.
And so eventually you realize, I'm supposed to be doing patience. And then you try. And what happens? You maybe aren't killing anyone anymore, but you're still shouting at them and you're still thinking, I want you to die. Eventually, it's a gradual path. It gets better step by step,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that confidence word, it's the same thing in Shin Buddhism. I'm not, that the word is Shinjen. And it has been mistranslated. I don't know if you know of Dr. Well, now I've forgotten his name, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, the word Shinjen is typically mistranslated, I think, as faith, and then therefore they think the Shin religion is just like a sort of a Christian religion, and
right.
because of and much of the reasoning for people like having that negative reaction and pushing it away is from a mistranslation. So that's why it's very cool that there's people like your daughters who do what they do, right? Because that it's somebody who can read the original text was set us straight. But that word is said to be really confidence as well, and
interesting.
Yeah, same kind of thing, and that's the more real translation. And I think for and this is going to lead to another question to you, but from my point of view, and this goes back to that things find us instead of we looking for them. is whenever you put one foot in front of the other or take one step towards something that you think will make you better or alleviate fear or make you a better person for other people or whatever the thing. And if you continue on that path, you are then led to the thing that maybe you don't know what it is, right? And that can be that can be karma, or I don't know if people don't believe in karma, I don't know how they would rationalize that, but or maybe it is just the karma of action and reaction. If you keep going, inertia takes over. Inertia doesn't take over. I mean, momentum takes over, right? Is it? I mean, it could be that.
It's such a dicey thing, really, because, again, you have to have confidence to keep going, and yet there are ups and downs. So, for instance, I think it's from a Pure Land school in China, where they talk about, Amitabha's compassion. I mean, normally the smallest stone, the smallest impurity will sink to the bottom of the ocean. But because of Amitabha's compassion, you've got a big boat. And so you can put a big giant boulder on that boat and it won't sink. But yet at the same time, you have to put up a sail to catch the wind. So you have to do something. But at the same time, there has to be that underlying, deep confidence, because without that, we're always going in one direction, then another direction, back and forth. There's no consistency. There's no training of the mind.
Right, and then that's in the Pure Land schools, and in Jodo Shinshu, they talk about other power, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. And the other power, most people think that you're giving yourself over to other power, some like great dualistic deity, right?
Right.
But because anything like this is Buddhism, there is no dualistic deity. I mean, you can't. You can't think of it that way. But my sensei always says it takes self power to reach other power, and that's the putting the sail up, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'll give you a personal example. I mean, it made me realize that there was other power going on despite everything I was aware of. So when we first were wanting to move from Minneapolis, where we were, to Rochester, New York, to be close to the Rochester Zen Center. At that time, the Zen Center was having all these kind of ex-hippie types flood in, and there was no room. And so they had this organizational idea: why don't we have affiliate groups around the country? And so there was an affiliate group in Madison, Wisconsin, and they told us to move there instead of coming to Rochester. So we did. But of course, Madison, Wisconsin, what a place to try to get a job. It's full of graduate students and all these college types hanging around because they like Madison. So, I had real trouble getting work. I was working in retail shops as clerks and that. And the bottom just fell out of us economically. Mm-hmm. And I was very much in kind of a self-power kind of guy. I was just thinking I was going to do all this meditation, all these wonderful things that I was going to do, all of this. And everything was falling apart. And I was like in despair. And one day I took my lunch break from the retail shop where I was selling, third world stuff. and I went to the University of Wisconsin Art Museum, where they had some Buddha figures. And I was just looking at the Buddha figures, just idling away my time. And suddenly it welled up from within me. I looked at that Buddha figure and I said, please help me. And I started crying.
I hear it.
And in an instant, all my pain went away. And I was just dumbfounded, because my conceptual framework that I had was, you just meditate and meditate and meditate and meditate. There wasn't really a devotional aspect to this at all. And so I was really kind of stunned. And from what you said, as far as putting up the sail, I mean, it makes me think on, even in the highest teaching, so to speak, of Tibetan Buddhism, Guru Yoga. It's something that's a huge problem usually for Western Buddhists, let alone secular types.
Right.
But the whole point of the outer Lama, that exists in the Vajrayana, not the other Buddhist schools. Normally the teacher is someone who's a little bit farther down the path than you, a good friend that you can rely on. But in the Vajrayana, yes, it can be like that too, but it can be, you can consider your teacher to be a Buddha. It's a very fierce kind of practice. But nonetheless, the whole point of the outer Lama or guru is to bring you to your inner guru. It's not some sort of blind faith or adulation or any of those kinds of things. All of Buddhism is training the mind.
Yeah, and that was my I was leading in the next two questions, and the next two questions, one of them was tell me more about the guru concept, because I'm actually ticking off areas that I've heard complaints about, about Tibetan Buddhism, and not all of. That's another thing maybe you can touch on. I think that's probably the best way to start. Is Tibetan Buddhism is not necessarily all Vajrayana. It's not all tantric and
correct
and shamanistic from the Bon religion, and people have that misconception,
right?
And I get that.
Right.
You walk into a Tibetan temple if you've never been to one, especially if you're coming from some place that's like a Zen. Zen center or something.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, just the aesthetics can knock you on your rear end, right?
My first, my second Vajrayana retreat was at Mount Baldy Zen Center. I think it was Sasaki Roshi there. He was taking a month off, and so they rented their Zen center to Lama Tarchin, and they kept like 3 little novice monks, American novice monks up there just to keep the place going, right, while we filled up. So Lama Tarchin shows up with his U-Haul truck, and I'm used to Zen. You have your cushion,
right,
and that's about it. In the shrine room during the retreats, a little tiny Manjushri statue. That's about it.
That's right.
And Lama Tarchin shows up with a U-Haul that's full of stuff, and he took this Zendo, which was just, and Sasaki Roshi especially, very, very severe, I call it, kind of Japanese aesthetic. Nothing, just bare. And Lama Tarchin fills up this shrine room with, tankas, these paintings of a female Buddha who's naked and is dancing on a corpse, and she's got flames for hair and all this kind of stuff. So he fills up this. I'm up there early helping him set up. And at one point I saw one of these Zen novices looking in the window of his Zendo and looking at all these bizarre things on the wall. And because I was from Zen, I knew what was going through his mind. And so I walked up behind him, and he turned around and he looked at me and he said, "This is really weird." And somebody once upon a time said that Tibetan Buddhism appears to be Mexican Catholicism on LSD.
Yeah, and that's it. And I think it's very hard to explain. It takes a long time to get to an understanding of it. So it's very reasonable for people to walk into a Tibetan temple, center, whatever, and feel as if that, oh no, this is not for me. This is just absolutely.
Right. And then when they hear about Guru Yoga,
then it's,
all our actually good sense comes up, but all our hesitations, because there are so many. The religious world has been full of charlatans from day one. And
exactly. and see, those two things go together. It's that the difference of all the aesthetics, the guru stuff, the chanting stuff, the bell ringing, the conch blowing. Right. It's just a little. It's too weird, really.
It's too weird. I know, because that was my reaction. I was Mr. Skeptical Mind, scientific mind. Then somehow I got involved in Zen. Well, that was okay, because and the next thing I knew, I'm in the midst of all these crazy people.
So this is where you have to jump off and explain to our listeners what the heck. What is all that stuff, right? I know this is something that we can't do in the length of a podcast, but I know, Frank, that you are capable of sort of cutting to the chase and saying, so what are the images? Why do we have them? What is the guru? Right. And why is that still Mahayana Buddhism, really? Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because, again, the advantage, first of all, Tibetan Buddhism is something of a misnomer, because, I mean, yes, there's a Tibetan flavor there, and you can't deny the Tibetan contribution. But if you read, say the commentaries on the Avatamsaka or the Huayan Sutra by those great Chinese masters, Qi Yi, and all these people in medieval China.
Right.
My daughter, for instance, spent a summer in Taiwan in a monastery, and the teachings they were giving there were just the same as Tibetan Buddhism. So it's just that as Americans, Buddhism is still pioneering here, and especially say, the Rochester Zen Center. Most of the Western Zen teachers are descendants of the Samboko Dan, which was a different organization, founded by Yasutani Roshi in Japan in the late 1940s, I believe. And, I read somewhere there's wonderful works done by Robert Scharf at Berkeley on the Samboko Dan. It means the Three Treasures organization, I think. I don't know Japanese. At any rate, we've got a little sliver of this. When I went to Japan, for instance, the Zen shrines, the Zen altars are just, they look like a Tibetan altar. They're just loaded with offerings and symbolism, and all these are just helps. They're just helps. And it makes sense to me that it initially comes to America like it did to China or Tibet. The initial coming of Dharma to a land, kind of people pick up on it for one reason or another. I'm told in China it was the aristocrats. Somehow it fed something, some literary nature or something that they were attracted to. And so too in America. So Edward Kanze, though, this man who first translated the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, he was a professor at Berkeley at one point. And he said, he would always end his lectures on the Perfection of Wisdom with some sort of nod to try to pacify his American students in their democratic, hedonistic, feministic, anti-intellectual, and I don't know what else, tendencies. But in the end, I would always relent and tell them that it was not so much important that the Buddha appeal to them, but that they appeal to Lord Buddha. So Tibet is this broad, many, many practices. Buddhism came to Tibet 1,500 years after the Buddha had passed away, and at the peak of Indian cultural development. And it's just a remarkable thing. It took centuries for it to be transmitted. And the Tibetans, a very different culture. They were warlike. They were like, we think of Genghis Khan. They conquered the capital of China, Xi'an.
Right.
And all sorts of stuff going on. But they transmitted, so they have very helpful, I believe, sort of conceptual frameworks and classifications of the teachings, which have been very helpful to me. And they said basically that there's a whole category of teachings that are self-liberation. And the basic vow there is the basic refuge vow is do no harm, stop harming.
Right.
And then that will take you to a very, very high state, it said. Literally people can walk through walls. I mean, the arhats, the conquerors, no more suffering. But it said at some point you can rest in non-suffering, literally for eons. But at some point a Buddha appears in your mind and you realize that all the other suffering beings are still out there. So you begin to practice the Mahayana. So for the Tibetans, the Mahayana is this path of perfections, what the Dalai Lama teaches publicly, this vast compassion, love and compassion that leads you to bodhicitta, wanting to liberate others and to take on that burden through the practices and the training of the mind. So that's the ordinary, we call it Mahayana. The extraordinary is called Vajrayana, Tantrayana, Mantrayana.
Mm-hmm.
It is not separate in motivation. And if it is, it's not it. Mm. The motivation is exactly the same. It differs only in method. And the difference is in both self-liberation and the ordinary conventional Mahayana, we're practicing the path of causes. We believe that if you practice patience, there'll be, a patient mind will result. A thoroughly trained mind will result. If we practice all these things and we've practiced the causes, we're going to get the results down the line. But in the Vajrayana, they reverse it. And so because Buddha said we have Buddha nature, and we are Buddhas right now, we just haven't recognized it, then we can imagine ourselves to be a Buddha right now. We're practicing the result. So it's the resultant path. That's why it requires faith too, because to practice considering all your fellow practitioners as highly evolved bodhisattvas, that's hard to do. One of the root downfalls of the tantric path is, I think it's the 13th vow. If you consider a female to be an ordinary human being, you have tarnished your tantric vow. This is very hard practice, but it has to come out of the renunciation, do no harm, and then it has to come out of the vast view of trying to benefit all beings. And that's where the challenge comes. So we had at the Dharma Center, for instance, a really wonderful young Lama who's studying at Emory right now, Rangel Yeshe. And he was teaching loving kindness and compassion. And in a question-answer period, someone said, well, will you tell us about the 5 Buddha families? Very kind of tantric kind of symbolism. And he said, I don't know anything about that. But then he gave this wonderful answer on emptiness and wisdom, which is what those 5 Buddha families are. That's exactly what they are. Right. But this person was all into the
classification.
Classification. What kind of crown were they wearing? All this kind of stuff, which, is helpful if your motivation is, I want to help beings. Dalai Lama says the purpose of the Tantra is that it's a very direct, powerful path, but it's only because it's not to enlighten yourself. It's because your desire to liberate beings is stronger than your desire to enlighten your enlightenment comes along with it. But it's the work for other beings that matters. So it's very profound, and it has all sorts of protections because it's easily misled, especially with our Westerners who, we're Americans. We're very dualistic.
Right.
We're going to do it, and then we're going to tell the Asians how they were doing it wrong for the last 2,500 years.
Well, and also
we're really amazing.
Well, and then also I wasn't a very experienced Vajrayana practitioner, although I practiced a bit. I flunked Nundro, and that's when I ended up at Bright Dawn. And that's a story for another time. But it actually ties back to our first story about things coming to you despite yourself. It was in my, and I don't know if I've ever told you this personally, but it was it was my practice of Nundro that led me to where I am now, I believe.
Yeah, there you go.
I've always thought so because there was such a cut for me. There was such I can't do this anymore. I just can't. Yeah. I gotta run away. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm running away. and that's kind of what happened. And then this thing that was right in front of me all along popped up, and then I sort of found my path. But it wasn't that it's how when you go through stages and then you leave a path, like your Zen stage, but when you revisit everything, you see how it's all part of you still. It's all
exactly right.
And so I've always called myself some kind of weird combination of Tibetan Zen Shin. I don't know if there. I don't think there is such a thing, but it's the
purity of the mind unfolding, manifesting.
Yeah.
And it's because you had that purity of mind when you were doing Nundro, it led you to your path.
Yeah.
And I felt the same way, like you alluded to Zen. I look at my time with Zen as completely positive, but a purification. I was just having to grind through all in my own style, all of my wrong understandings. And I couldn't have done that without having to sit there in full lotus, screaming in pain and thinking I shouldn't move. It's like,
and doing it. Yeah, exactly.
And doing it.
Yeah.
But we don't know. There's really something that is, uncreated that's going on here. And yet we are that. I mean, it's truly, really wonderful.
But
when
I don't want to stop you. You were going on a good place.
All right, I'm just going to say that it's important, I think, especially for people who maybe have like a secular interest in Buddhism, to realize there's only one Dharma.
Yeah,
there are all these different manifestations, and even in a place like Tibet, where the monks took power They had governments. They had to get food on the table and punish people. All these things, and there are all sorts of wild, sort of undharmic things that have happened. I mean, Tibetans are human beings,
Right.
and yet they have, like we have this faith in Einstein in physics. Say, the ordinary Tibetan peasant has that kind of faith in Dharma because their Thomas Jefferson was a monk. Their great figures were monks.
Yeah.
And it's a remarkable thing that they've done if you think about it, because like they didn't. The Sanskrit, the mantras are all in Sanskrit. They didn't put them into Tibetan. And to really take over without trying to fix it, another culture, they took all that stuff from India and they adapted it obviously to the Tibetan style and mind, but they didn't monkey with it. You see
Right.
these teachings from 1,000 years ago, and there it is. They're being that's what's so impressive about the scholars that they have, because they're trying to present the Dharma as the Dharma should be presented, and not, there's a danger of charisma always.
Yeah.
Especially great teachers, they have great charisma. People can get lost on the charisma, but it's always about the meaning and the understanding. All, like the Buddha said, my teachings are a finger pointing at the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Don't mistake the finger for the moon. And that's what people do. Should there be one finger pointing, two fingers pointing, then they get in a fight.
That's so true. But when it comes to like what you talked about, like explaining the Vajrayana, which you did explain very well, I think though, even if somebody hasn't even had any experience with that visualization practice or those empowerments, they would probably not even get what we're saying, but unless they've studied it or explored it a little bit. But I remember when I first came to the Dharma Center and asked you, if everything is empty and we're supposed to start seeing everything is empty, why are we creating these grand imaginary things? That was the thing that bothered me so much.
That's a good question. Yeah.
So
no, it's a very good question.
So answer it for us. So I learned from you, so I'll let you answer.
Yeah. Yeah. The power of the visualization practice, they're extremely skillful. They're actually taking you through each step in the death and rebirth process. So you've practiced this in your mind. So then when you die, you know what you're doing already. But basically think about it. These practices start with, it's like a symphony or something. It starts with taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Mm-hmm. Then, which is that vow not to harm and to benefit all in the Mahayana. And then you generate the four immeasurables of vast loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, or spontaneous joy in the virtues of others, and the great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So you do that. And then what happens? You say a mantra and you drop your attachment to ordinary appearances. And then out of that emptiness arises the seed syllable of that particular Buddha. All these Buddhas have the same essence. It doesn't make any difference. But you have this, you are that seed syllable. So then we go through this elaborate creation where, light goes to the Buddhas, light comes back to the seed syllable, which you are. Light goes out to all the sentient beings, blessing them. Light comes back and you transform, you become that actual Buddha in the midst of this palace. It's all made of light and is beautiful. And then we go through all these things, active things with your mind. But at the end, what do? We dissolve that visualization to prevent attachment even to any kind of form. And because we created it in the first place, we were also giving up our attachment to emptiness itself. So in the end, we give the dedication, we give it all back to everybody. And it's extremely skillful, but you have to know what you're doing. And the better way, I think, is, it comes through contact with qualified teachers.
Right.
That's why, for instance, at White Lotus, myself, we now have a Kempo in residence, Kempo Konchog Monlam, and this is so wonderful. And we have, qualified lamas come and they'll give the empowerments and all of that. But we don't do that ourselves there because it's so simple. It's so down to earth. And yet there'd be very elaborate methods. But again, they're just fingers pointing at the moon. So if you listen to a great teacher, such as, His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche, his teachings are total emptiness, but they're totally about the afflictions.
Right.
And you have to know the meaning. And again, it's all about seeing the nature of these afflictions in our mind, and then to see how the example that's given, for instance, when they talk about the path of renunciation, conventional Mahayana, the extraordinary Mahayana, the Vajrayana, they give the example of it's like someone, you're walking through a forest of poisonous trees, and the self-liberation way is to take out this heavy, sharp axe. It's heavy because that's the power of concentration. It's sharp because that's insight meditation, vipassana.
Right.
And you're chopping at the root of the tree, and so that poisonous tree falls over. And that's the path of renunciation, the path of self-liberation. The poisons don't come up anymore. Poisons being our afflicted negative mind states that cause upset us. So that's a type of practice. It's said at that type of practice that a male form is actually more conducive to practicing that. Females can accomplish that too, but the male form said, for whatever reasons, is a little bit helpful. Then the conventional Mahayana, you're walking through the same poisonous forest, but now you take a little bit of the poisonous fruit as an antidote. It's kind of like homeopathy.
Right.
So when you see the poison of hatred arise in your mind, you know from your studies that the antidote is patience. So you use that arising of anger in the mind as a stimulus to practice the antidote, which is patience. Very safe. Comes to full Buddhahood. At this level, male, female doesn't make any difference. Mm-hmm. Then the Vajrayana, you're walking through the same poisonous forest, but now you take that poisonous fruit and take a big bite out of it. I mean, this seems insane to the ordinary dualistic viewpoint. Has to be protected by empowerment, by samayas, vows with a particular teacher and lineage, all these protections that are there. But at that form, that also goes to Buddhahood because the motivation is the benefit of all. That's the training of the mind. But at that level, the female form is actually superior to the male. Again, men can accomplish men. I believe my own teacher, Garchen Rinpoche, His Holiness Chetsang Rinpoche, His Holiness Dalai Lama, I believe they're fully realized people, and they have used those methods. But there's nothing in contradiction to the conventional Mahayana, the path of the perfections.
Well, now you can hear people, I hear people having problems here, right?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I had problems myself.
Okay, exactly. You can hear people having problems. So, and you know what the problems are. It's like it takes these fully realized beings, like, you know, His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche and so on and so forth, and the protection of the samayas, and it's those empowerment things that people are saying, well, but what's that? You know what?
Right.
And that sort of seems like that's the sort of magic stuff that people have and I don't know if it's just in the West. I think it could be in the East too. People have even in the way both cultures have merged, these days.
Yeah.
It's probably both, but that there's a rejection of that notion that you need that, or that is somehow important. So does that kind of thing, and I'm not talking about the age of Mappo or anything, but is that kind of thing saying, are we saying that, how can Vajrayana continue in a culture that's becoming the way our mixed culture is, when there's those? Yeah. Do you get my point, or am I going too far?
Yes. The whole thing is about the training of the mind, and it isn't necessary that anything continue. Like the Dalai Lama said, I might be the last Dalai Lama.
Yeah, he said that.
If it's not benefiting people, I'm not going to take rebirth. So it's all about the training. And I was not attracted to visualization at all. But it was only because a teacher that I really had very kind of deep confidence in, that he said, why don't you do this? And I said, okay, I'll do it. I mean, I didn't want to do it. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So the important thing is that the lotus of your mind opens up naturally. We can't rip open the bud
right,
and think that we're getting somewhere. That was my previous sort of self-power idea.
Right.
You can't do that. And so you don't have to worry about any of those things. The practice will arrive. It's this fundamental confidence in that the Buddha was not mistaken. and you can see the results of 2,500 years of, think about it. It's just so amazing to me how people get lost and miscommunications are so tremendous. And then when you see different cultures that somehow these teachings have transformed positively, wildly different cultures. India and China, it's like,
good point.
in India, you'll have like a certain Buddhist concept, like a paragraph of this beautiful, like poetic prose. But in Chinese Buddhism, the same thing is one little pithy phrase.
Right. Right.
So wildly different. I'm told that Sanskrit has the most highly developed grammar of any language, and Chinese basically has no grammar. It's like, and yet they've both been transformed.
Yeah.
So the important thing is that confidence when the Buddha says that we have Buddha nature, that the nature of our mind is not subject to birth and death, and that this can be realized. And the way to realize it is by benefiting others. It's just so mind-boggling and radical. Can it actually be true? But the important thing is that you can practice that, and then you see.
Yeah, and that's true. But so like what you're saying is like what I'm saying. What my first question was is like could Vajrayana, the practice of Vajrayana, particularly kind of I know there's still Tibetan centers everywhere. I don't know if there are as many as there were like 10 years ago, or there's more. I haven't really followed sort of the trend, if there is one. But I'm wondering, since some of the teachers who came over here first, and started spreading the teachers, have started declaring, Buddhism without beliefs, like Stephen Batchelor and stuff. Is there a trend now away from this very sort of thing?
I don't know about trends, but I do know I'm impressed by the people that I see around. Say Gartner Rinpoche as an example. The people that he's inspired and have practiced with him, something very solid and very good. And whether something continues or not, I don't know. I don't find myself following Stephen Batchelor.
Right.
I would recommend more Dzongtsar Khyentse. So his movies or his most recent book, I don't know if it's his most recent one. My daughter gave it to me for Christmas, which I really liked. It says, "The Guru Drinks Bourbon?" ?
Oh, yeah. I that's on my wish list, actually. So,
Well, it's very good because he is totally modern. I think a realized teacher, but he's really so cognizant of the West and the difficulties. He's very critical of Tibetan lamas who are just, for whatever reason, I don't know, are too narrow in their interests in that. Mm-hmm. But what I like is that he directs the very kind of questions that you're having here. Mm-hmm. These kinds of things that appeal to someone like Guru Yoga, we want to run in the other direction.
Right.
My point is that you don't have to do any of that stuff. That all happens naturally, or it doesn't. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's not the only way to Buddhahood. And if people are benefiting by having if they just take the vow, I want to stop harming people,
right?
Even if they don't believe in karma, that's going to be a benefit to them. What happens? You're immediately in less trouble.
Yeah.
If you're not harming other people, there isn't all this kickback coming at you, blowback all the time. So, Buddhism, again, is just completely practical, and it's beneficial in this life. The odd thing about it is that I really think someone who has what might be called a more transcendent view actually has a better life in this lifetime. And whether we understand how that works or not, we need to understand it. We want to understand. But even we don't, we get the benefit. It's like they say, if you practice bodhicitta, your life will improve. You will come to Buddhahood eventually. It's like if you jump off a cliff, you're going to fall down, even if you don't believe in gravity.
Well, exactly, and I think that's absolutely true. And I've seen it with people who've practiced basic. Just basic Mahayana principles, or started putting, doing the four immeasurables, or just one, simple little thing every day, right? And I've seen the big change, in them, or people who take up, even though mindfulness is all the buzz, although I tend to refer to as Mick mindfulness. There is a
Right.
there is a benefit to mindfulness, but also it needs to be founded on for the benefit of all beings. It needs to be founded on the doing good for others, that bodhisattva vow, the sense of bodhicitta. And I think people come to that all naturally if they start doing some of these practices. That's the interesting phenomena I have found. Even if that was not their intention, it happens. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, and that's a very important point, because there are all sorts of bad experiences. There's one written about right now in the, I can't remember. I think it's in the Atlantic or the Guardian or the New Yorker maybe this month, about somebody who went to a Vipassana retreat and had some sort of psychotic breakdown.
Oh, yeah. I read a little snippet about that. I didn't read the whole article. Yes.
I mean, we're dealing with the human mind, which, according to the Buddhists, is the most powerful thing in the universe and all the universes that we don't even see. So this has been worked out. I mean, if you just launch into things, I had one person come to the Dharma Center once and said, gee, I want to meditate. And I said, why do you want to do that? And he says, well, I want to be able to sleep less so I can work more. And I said, well, meditation, you can do that. I'm told that you can get by with less sleep, but the amount of effort you have to put into it to get that kind of result, you don't want to do it. You're not going to do it.
Right.
The motivation is so important. And also, I mean, again, training the mind. It's about discovering what's real instead of living in our dream of ourself all the time and living in our self-created dramas and the castles in the sky, which always fall apart because they're based on delusion. And so to do the simplest practice, like just someone came to Lama Govinda once, the German man who has passed away now, wrote Way of the White Clouds. He was living in India, and some Western seeker, like the late 60s, came to him and said, I want to come to enlightenment. And he says, it's very good. Why don't you start with kindness? There's stuff that we can all do.
Right.
That's where you want to be, not worry about the sort of the attraction of the higher teachings and all of that. It's very seductive.
Yeah.
It's very seductive.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a teacher who's pulling the rug out from underneath you and showing you, keeping you humble all the time, it can be dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's the case with all sort of like spiritual and religious, and like you said, it can be made up of charlatans. And if you find an authentic teacher who, like I always talk about my sensei, he has this sort of incestuous way of teaching. You haven't even clue that he's teaching. He's just joking with you and doing this and that.
Yeah.
Next, you hang up the phone or whatever, and then you think, oh man, he just gave me a shot.
That's right, exactly.
I had no idea, and well, I better be working on this. But it's like I think that's the way I think. The way it is, and when people do come to it, it's like they always come to it with these grandiose notions of whatever enlightenment.
Right.
It's always enlightenment, really. Why should I say whatever? Isn't it always enlightenment that they want?
Yeah, right.
and sometimes, and my thing in this whole everyday Buddhism concept that I've launched is, enlightenment is really just seeing things as they are. It's shining a light on it. That's it. That's what it.
That's right.
That's what it is. And most of us, really, that's when they say, "I want enlightenment." That's not really what they want. They don't want you to shine.
Right.
That's not what they want. They'd be like saying, "No, that's not what they want." I had this, the Al Bloom. That's who I was going to talk to you about before. Dr. Al Bloom.
Yeah.
The great Shin teacher and doctor. He taught my lay ministry class, and and he set off a real just like you had these experiences where wow, you got it all in like a second. He set off this thing for me about getting other power because I could not get past. It was like a greased pig for me. I could not get past the concept of the deity, the God, the whatever, just could not,
right.
I couldn't make that leap. And then he told a story once to our class about there was a woodpecker and he was on a tree in a forest where there were loggers, right? And you might have heard the story, and he's pecking away. And he doesn't know. He's so busy pecking away. He doesn't know that the loggers have come to his tree, right? And they're down at the base of the tree. And all of a sudden, he's whacks one good peck on the tree, and the whole tree falls over. And he says, "Whoa, I did that?" So
the teachings and the traditions are protection. I mean, even taking refuge means to seek protection. Protection from sufferings and the stupid things we do. We're all looking for happiness,
Right.
but we're all creating the seeds of suffering. I mean, over and over and over and over again. But I find these traditional teachings so beneficial. There's one from the Chinese Pure Land of Shantou, I think he's one of the patriarchs.
Shantou, yes.
Yes, and he had this, I don't know if it was a dream or what, but I've always found it so meaningful. I mean, he's talking about walking through a forest, with dangerous animals and bandits. Mm-hmm. And these are our afflictions and just our wrong view of things. And so what do? People they come to a river, and there's this thin ribbon going across the river, and Buddha Amitabha's on the other side. So you want to go there, but the ribbon is scary. This little thin ribbon, and on one side of the ribbon, there's total flames.
It's the path of fire.
And on the other side,
right.
Curling waters, I'm going to drown. And yet Buddha Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, is behind saying, no, go. You'll be all right.
Yeah.
And as you walk, it gets wider and wider and wider because Amitabha's compassion, you get there. So it seemed to me that, the practice of like self-power and that is in that forest with the historical Buddha. In the Amitayus Sutra, Amitayus praises the Buddha Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, because he came to enlightenment in this deceptive world,
right,
where nothing is conducive.
Right.
So we've got Buddha Shakyamuni there. Amitabha's on the other side, walking on that river. That's the path of faith, which is necessary. I don't know if this is right, but I've always thought of the visualizations and practicing in the Pure Land, which is what the visualizations are, as, sort of thinking you're on the other side of the river already and dancing around with Buddha Amitabha. I don't know if that's right, but it's kind of the framework that's occurred to me. But in the end, it comes down to looking at your own mind, recognizing the afflictions that come up, applying the antidote to them, and then in the gap between the spaces, that's where the vastness is. Yeah. And to abide, to train your mind in that place where we're not this and that, right and wrong, Buddhist, non-Buddhist, all of those, the whole realm of desire. Yeah. And I think all Buddhist traditions, recognize that, and they give different methods of practicing it, training the mind in what we have already. So it's totally wonderful.
It is. And isn't that a great place to stop? Do you think? This is a great place.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Frank. I think you did help take the edge off for some people. I think I felt it, take the edge off the sense of the sort of strangeness of Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah. I think those who have any familiarity with any sort of Mahayana Buddhist traditions would feel very comfortable. But
good.
Not every center has a Frank, so we don't know to make it do that. But I think if you spend enough time, you would find yourself at home, and even the wrathful demons on the walls won't scare you, right?
Yeah, right.
The wrathful Buddhas and Bodhisattvas.
That's right.
So thank you so much for being a part of it, Frank. I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. I'm so happy with what you're doing.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Frank. It was a joy for me. I miss his teaching, so I hope you felt the same way. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you for joining me as always. Thanks to everyone who listens to the podcast, comments on my website or the new public Facebook group, and of course those who donate to help keep the content written, produced, and distributed. If I haven't replied to any of your messages yet, I will. I always try to reach out with a private email of thanks, but be patient because, as I continue to say, the numbers are growing and they continue to grow each episode. And because of that, as I mentioned last episode, I launched a new Dharma to Go forum that for a small donation, you will be guaranteed a timely and personal answer to your question. Dharma to Go can be found at dharmatogo.com or through the Dharma to Go tab on my website. Additionally, I'm looking for more ways to offer valuable extras for the growing community around the podcast. So please consider supporting my work through a recurring or one-time donation through the donate tab on my website, everydaybuddhism.com. And don't hesitate to share this podcast with friends and family members, and of course, rate, review, and all those good things. So until next time, keep making your everydays better.